Well, welcome everyone to day 2 of the NNLM Health Misinformation Symposium. I'm Carolyn Martin, and my pronouns are she and they. I am the Outreach and Education Coordinator for the network of the National Library of Medicine, Region 5, which is located at the University of Washington Health Sciences Library in Seattle, Washington. We have just a few technical items to cover. VFairs is providing technical assistance today, and the NNLM staff are keeping an eye on the chat with me. All attendees have been muted, but we do welcome your comments in the Zoom chat at any time. Please be sure to select everyone from the drop-down menu when posting your comments in chat to ensure that everyone sees them. We also ask that you submit your questions to the speaker by using the Q&A function to ensure that they do not get lost in the chat. We have live closed captioners for this event. You can access this closed captioning by clicking on the icon Show Captions at the bottom of your screen. And if you would like to share on social media, we encourage you to use the hashtag for the event, HealthMisinfoNNLM. Before we get started, I would like to share a little bit about who we are. The National Institutes of Health is the nation's leading medical research agency, and many of you might be more familiar with the National Cancer Institute, which is one of the many institutes and centers at NIH. The NLM, or the National Library of Medicine, is one of the 27 institutes and offices of the National Institutes of Health. It's the world's largest biomedical library in the world and produces online resources like PubMed and Medline Plus. NNLM, the network of the National Library of Medicine, is an outreach program of NLM, working to ensure that health professionals and the public have equal access to health information. NNLM is made up of 7 regional medical libraries, 3 national offices, and 4 national centers, all providing training, funding, and engagement opportunities to over 9,000 NNLM member organizations. I hope that you found yesterday's sessions informative and thought-provoking, and that you had the opportunity to connect with others who share your passion for combating health misinformation. Yesterday, we explored the impact of health misinformation on individuals and society, and heard from a number of experts on the challenges and complexities of addressing this issue. Throughout today's sessions, we will hear from a number of experts on the challenges of combating health misinformation and explore the various strategies and approaches that are being used to address this complex issue. One challenge is the abundance of misinformation and the speed at which it can spread. With the rise of social media and other online platforms, false health information can reach a wide audience quickly and easily. As a result, it can be difficult to contain and correct this information before it spreads too far. Another challenge is the complexity of health information itself. Health information can be difficult to understand and interpret, even for those of us with a strong background in science and medicine. This complexity can make it difficult for individuals to distinguish accurate health information from false or misleading information. Throughout today's sessions, we will explore various strategies for combating health misinformation, including the use of digital literacy initiatives, partnerships with community organizations, and collaborations between healthcare professionals, researchers, librarians, and other stakeholders. We hope that today's sessions will provide you with valuable insights and tools that you can take back to your own work in combating health misinformation. By working together and leveraging the resources available, we can make a difference in promoting accurate health information and empowering individuals to make informed decisions about their health. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion, and I'm looking forward to another engaging day of sessions and discussions. It is my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker. Calling BS in the Age of Big Data was a very popular webinar presentation he did for NNLM a few years ago, which built on several lectures given in the Calling BS class at the University of Washington. Jevin West is an associate professor at the University of Washington Information School. He is the co-founder of the new Center for an Informed Public at the UW, aimed at resisting strategic misinformation, promoting an informed society, and strengthening democratic discourse. His research and teaching focus on the impact of data and technology on science and society, with a focus on slowing the spread of misinformation. He is the co-author of a new book, Calling Bullshit: The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World, which helps non-experts question numbers, data, and statistics without an advanced degree in data science. Welcome, Jevin. We are really looking forward to your presentation, and I'll let you go ahead and present, and I'll stop sharing my slides.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Carolyn, and thanks so much to all of you for taking the time and for the work you do actually trying to improve our information environments. So much of the work that I do with my colleagues in our center is looking at organizations and individuals that spend a lot of effort and resources adding noise to our information environments and adding pollution. And so it's great to always be working with librarians. As has already been said, I actually work in an information school where we get to train the next generation of librarians, and there's just no better group to be really addressing this, one of the most important challenges, I think, of our time, is dealing with this rise of misinformation. So today what I wanted to do was to first start with some of the resources and potential synergies that I think we might have in our center with many of you. We have several ongoing projects, national projects and local projects that I want to mention where we are looking to collaborate. So instead of putting that at the end of the slides, I'm actually going to put that at the beginning. But before I get started too, I just want to generally talk about this issue of misinformation, specifically in the medical field. As we all know, this is, when it comes to misinformation, medical misinformation, it's one of the areas where if we make improvements, it can literally save lives. And we certainly have seen it throughout the pandemic. I've seen it through conversations with medical professionals. I've been meeting with different groups and with medical students and faculty at our own university here at the University of Washington. And a lot of these medical professionals don't have the opportunity to get any training when it comes to dealing with misinformation, yet they spend more and more of their time in the office with patients talking about things that the patient has found online that many times is just not true and not from good sources. So this is an opportunity, I think, for the library profession to really step up and provide the resources and training for our medical professionals. And certainly within our own field of library sciences, we have lots to work on in this space as well. But I think all of you know, which is why you're probably here today to talk about this particular issue, that health misinformation is a serious threat to public health, just as the Surgeon General of the United States recently pointed out in a report that is being well circulated and cited. Actually, early on in the creation of this report, the Surgeon General's office had reached out to our center trying to figure out how to go about doing this. And I have to give them a lot of credit for being very careful about how they addressed this new area for them. It's not typical for the Surgeon General to be talking about an information science problem. This is something we do in the library world, in the information science world, but there's really been a strong partnership that I think is starting to grow. And the challenge, and I think just to continue with this quote, it can cause confusion, sow mistrust, harm people's health, and undermine public health efforts. And the World Health Organization and many other health organizations around the country and the world are starting to really recognize this. And again, I think that's the opportunity that we have in the library world, is to provide the expertise that we have, to provide the resources, and to identify some of the early trends or sort of trends in the misinformation space that we can try to sort of pre-bunk or sort of at least alert the world of. Certainly right now, we see a lot of misinformation coming out of, likely will come out of some of the new technologies with these large language models, and I'll talk about that a little bit later today. But there's been a lot of interesting papers recently that that basically look at the counterfactual of a world in which we did have a better, cleaner information environments, and people were less hesitant to take a vaccine, for example. How many lives could we have saved? And of course, these kinds of analyses are very difficult to do, and you can't put too much weight behind these, because counterfactual analyses are very, very hard. I think the point is that lives could literally be saved if we can address this sort of thing. But I want to start with a question, and this is one of those points of synergy that we might have, because we're starting to think about that with some programs we're developing. But since I had this audience of professionals that work in this space, there might be some opportunity to work together on this. And one of the questions we keep asking when talking to medical professionals is that what training exists for these professionals to deal with online misinformation, not just for themselves, but for addressing patients that come into their office asking these kinds of questions. And so we've been coming up with some ideas, and maybe during the question and answer period, we can maybe brainstorm some ways that we could go about doing this, or maybe there are programs already out there. There's many of you out there right now that might be working on this very thing. And I'd love to amplify that if there are those kinds of projects going on, because I think there's a real need in this space. But I'll first tell you a little bit about what I do. As Carolyn mentioned, I helped co-found with my colleagues the Center for an Informed Public, the University of Washington, and we spend a lot of our research time, actually a lot of our waking hours, actually living in kind of the darker corners of the internet, trying to understand how misinformation arises, how it gets amplified, how individuals get amplified, how the technology, the platforms, the design, the algorithms, how they amplify these things. We talk a lot about policy implications, both at the industry level and the platform level, and also at the federal and state level, about how those, what would be effective, what wouldn't be effective. And of course, we spend a ton of time thinking about intervention. So since we study and observe these things in the wild, we want to figure out ways to intervene. And that's where we spend most of our time. And we have this center, and it's a public center that's meant to be a resource for librarians, teachers, journalists, the public, community leaders, government, et cetera. So please reach out if you are looking for resources, looking for reports that we've done, research papers we publish many peer-reviewed research papers. We also do a lot of commentaries, we build resources, et cetera. But most of what we do on the research side is our expertise is in what's called computational social science, and we gather lots and lots of publicly available data through, of course, IRB support on our campus to look at the ways in which misinformation, disinformation, rumors, malinformation spread across the internet. And it allows us to see where there are commonalities during different crisis events, for example, or different election cycles, and try to see where there are general principles that seem to apply in all circumstances, and where there are more specific ones. We also do a lot of what's called rapid response. So we don't just publish papers and present those at conferences. We've really seen a need to respond with these research methods in not 5 years, but in 5 hours, or at least 5 days. And so we've developed some projects in collaboration with Stanford University, where we're doing real-time responses to things that we're observing when it comes to very specific things. So for example, on this project, we're looking for misinformation around election details. We're looking at, whether it's about election procedures or where to vote, et cetera, those kinds of things. And then we make that publicly available, transparently available to organizations that want to do something with that. We've got reports on this. We wrote about that in the 2020 election. We're also working on a new report based on the 2022 election. We've also expanded these projects into health-related issues like the Virality Project, which was meant to track misinformation around vaccines, primarily through the pandemic. But these kinds of processes that we've developed for doing rapid response, for studying it, observing it, and then making it available to different stakeholders, then we're actually studying that. We're supported by the National Science Foundation to study that and to try to figure out if we can build a template that could be used on other kinds of topics. So these just gives you a flavor of the kind of projects that we do. But it's not just research. Like I said, we really do we probably spend just as much time on the education and community engagement side, which is of course what librarians do, and on the policy side as well. As Carolyn mentioned, I have a book about this where it's mostly a book around data misinformation that comes wrapped in data, statistics, and science. I'm one of the biggest fans of science, but science, is sometimes hijacked, and we try to. This is a book meant to teach the public how to call BS on data misinformation, misinformation that comes from technology, and misinformation that looks like it's wrapped in science. And so it relates very much to the issue at hand here when it comes to health misinformation, because a lot of our examples are from health. In fact, we've thought about rewriting the entire book with the same principles, just with different examples from the pandemic and specifically around health issues. And then we also do programs like what we call Misinfo Day. So this is what we do on our campus. And if you're interested in this, please let us know. If you're on a university campus that has a little tiny bit of capacity, we've been doing this in collaboration with other universities where once a year, we bring in hundreds of high school students to our campus to have access to more of the public, because if we only look at university students or students that are in medical school, we miss a large proportion of the population. And what we do on this day is we have all these different modules that we make fully available. You don't even have to make them. We make them all available to any university or even high schools that want to use this. And we spend a day reflecting and thinking and playing games when it comes to this topic of misinformation. We just had ours in March. We did this in collaboration with Washington State University, and we're looking to expand to other universities across the country. And again, this is something where we've built a lot of the resources, although we also look to others to add to those resources. And if you're interested, definitely reach out because we're looking to expand this outside of Washington over the next several years. And this is our chance. We're hoping to maybe eventually have a national day devoted to this topic of misinformation, because for many students in high school, it might be their only day. They talk about digital literacy, information literacy, these topics that we care very much about in the information sciences and the library sciences. We also, just to give you some examples of things that we run during Misinfo Day and also run outside of Misinfo Day, is something called an escape room. So we developed what's called the Misinformation Escape Room. We have it in a digital form. We also have it in a physical form. We can print it and send it to you if you want to run. It's a really fun thing to run with your community or with your, your constituents, your students, others on campus or off campus. And there are a bunch of these different challenges that allow for these conversations around misinformation and things that both the young and old will see in online environments. And we definitely see this problem of misinformation as a K1 through K99. Everyone is susceptible, including those that study it. Like me, I study and breathe this every day, and yet I'm also susceptible to these things. But it's a fun way. We've done this escape room. We're actually translating it to many different languages. We're actually building it specific to different topics. So we're working with Fred Hutch here. This is being led by Chris Coward, and Jen Hali. We're faculty in our center that are working with the Fred Hutch here in Seattle to build one specifically around health nutrition, specifically around cancer patients. And so this is it's really amenable to other topics. So if you have a topic you want us to try to customize it to, we're open to suggestions. And if you've never done an escape room, it's a fun way to engage with topics that sometimes tend to be quite politically charged. We also have formed an organization called the Teachers for an Informed Public. This doesn't relate necessarily as much to your group, but I bring it up because it's one of the cooler events that I've seen happen to really do intergenerational teaching. And the idea here is that teachers in high schools will teach this topic of misinformation throughout the year. And then what they do is they make it, the students run kind of a Misinfo Day night. And what they do is they teach their neighbors, their grandparents, their parents, and then they have these conversations, and it's a great way for the community to be talking about this. And we have templates and all we've run this many times. And it's one of the cooler events that we do. Last one I went to was around 400, people came to this high school here in Seattle, and we've been doing it in other places as well. But it's a chance to, again, engage on this topic at the community level and let the community and students or anyone in the community run these kinds of things. Now, in the world of science and in the world of research, which many of you sort of interact with on a daily basis, certainly I do, we have this challenge of this overwhelming growth of the scientific literature. And a lot of the work that we do when it comes to misinformation is focused on society in general, but even science certainly is susceptible to some of these changes in information technology that misinformation rears its ugly head in many ways in the same way. So we see hype, we see we see clickbait, we see the rise of predatory journals, we see issues around now with ChatGPT and the challenges that's going to bring to the publishing system. In fact, my colleague Carl Bergstrom and I just finished a commentary that we'll be publishing in Nature Medicine, where we talk about the impact of that and some of these other issues on the academic publishing system. I'm happy to send it out if anyone's interested in that. But the point here is that we have lots of challenges still in this institution of science and research, and this isn't new and something that just arose to as as an addendum to the conversation about misinformation. We've had things like the reproducibility crisis. We have incentive issues. We have issues of how we fund science. We have issues of sometimes fraud in science, although fraud, I think it's pretty rare when it comes to the whole portfolio of misinformation in and about science. My colleague and I wrote a paper recently in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences where we talk about misinformation in and about science. And it certainly doesn't mean that science is broken and it doesn't work. It works despite these challenges. But I think this is where a lot of those issues that we talk about in this paper, and I'm happy to send that paper out as well, really, I think are issues that the librarian community are well aware of and can address because of their positioning and the work that they do and the mission that I think librarians really have. And so I'm happy to share that and talk more about that later in the discussion, but I just wanted to mention that. And there's all sorts of tools that people are developing. There's things that have been changed in the public, publishing system over the last, I think, 10 years or so, just as an example, like, pre-registration of, experiments before publishing is one way to get around, publication bias and the file drawer effect that we see in science. And I'm happy, I could give the entire lecture on that, but I didn't want to sort of sidestep the misinformation that we also have in science, not just in society and at the interface of society and the public on health issues, that in general, we have issues in the science system as well. And just as a quick little side project, I do say here, I conflict of interest on this one. I'm an advisor on this particular project. I've been working with some colleagues on developing an academic search engine that allows the public and people, of course, in research to ask questions of the literature, because a lot of times the literature is almost impenetrable for the public. Yet they have lots of questions certainly around health issues, and they're paying for the literature. Our tax dollars pay for a vast majority of that literature, and we want to make that available through the kinds of questions that you would be asking at the dinner table or that you would ask with friends and family. And so we have this new project called Consensus. It's a search engine where you can ask questions, and then it'll give you because using some claim extraction and actually, applying some of these technologies that everyone's hearing about now today, these large language models, you can ask questions of the literature, and it'll tell you not only where the literature that's, sort of addressing these questions, but the papers that are, showing confirmation of that particular question or the negative of that. So it's showing those that support a particular statement and those don't. So anyway, it's an ongoing project. It's something that I've been playing around with lots of different projects and research around building new search engines and visualization techniques for engaging the literature as well. And I'm again happy to go into that if we go into that area during the question and answer. So I'm almost through some of the resources. But I do want to put this website, because I'm not going to go through all the resources, but I wanted to do something different today when starting. A lot of times I just end and say, oh, we have all these resources to deal with this challenge of misinformation. Today I'm reversing it, and I'm actually I wanted to mention some of these resources and some of the things we have, and I can't go through everything. We have a ton of resources at our center, and if we don't have them, we can point you to other centers that we work with that also have these. So please feel free to reach out. We have an email on there. You can reach out to me, or just go to this website, and those will be some of the resources. So definitely check that out if you're interested in some of those resources. But I do want to just end with one last one, which I think relates very much to the librarian community. And that is a project that actually we're running today through our site visit from the National Science Foundation. It's supported by the National Science Foundation. And the project is called Co-Designing for Trust. So the idea here is to build interventions to misinformation with the communities that we're designing those interventions for. So not just having us build them in the ivory towers, but actually build interventions with journalists, rural librarians, community organizations, and with community colleges, community colleges. These are sort of the main groups that we're addressing. And we do this through workshops, and we're building these workshop templates to make those available to other librarians that would be interested in running some of these workshops with their own communities. And those could be academic communities, those could be public communities. And so we work with community organizers, librarians, teachers, and local journalists to do this kind of work. And the way that we do this, by the way, we have tons of partners in this project, and it's something that it's not just local in our area. We're doing sort of in partnership with the University of Texas and University of Washington and several other organizations. And the way that we do this is these workshops, and we built a bunch of methods for how you can run these workshops. And the idea behind these workshops is to work, let's say, for example, with teachers, or in our case, we've been working a lot with rural librarians. And we go in and we work with them and talk about the issues that they have at hand in their communities. And then we use the resources that we have, leverage those, but then build those interventions with the individuals that will be using those interventions when it comes to misinformation. So this is a project that I'm really excited about, because it's not just us figuring out how to come up with interventions to misinformation, but it's working with these communities. So happy to share more information about that as well. And I just want to end in this resource section about this trust in librarians and also trust in medical professionals. One of the postdocs that we hired in our lab, Rachel Moran, is writing a book on trust. One of the things I've learned from her, and like looking at the literature and a lot of these surveys over the last 10 to 20 years, is that trust in institutions really has not been going in a positive way for most institutions. It's been going in a downward trend. But there are a few exceptions to that, and one of them is librarians. I think many of you know that you're one of the more trusted institutions and professionals out there, and that gives us an opportunity, and you an opportunity, to really step up when it comes to misinformation. And medical professionals are the same. I mean, there's some nuances to this particular question of trust when it comes to medical professionals during the pandemic, but overall they're highly trusted as well. So there's really an opportunity when it comes to health misinformation. All right, so that was kind of the reverse. Now I just want to get to more of the problem itself. And I think a lot of us are aware of the problem, but what I wanted to do for the rest of the talk is really identify some of the things that I've seen over the years, over the last 4 or 5 years, studying this and teaching it, when it comes to health misinformation in particular. So there's a couple points I really want to make throughout. I provide some examples, and then at the end, we can have an open discussion about things that you've seen, talk about some of the resources if you want, projects that are going on, and questions of things that I didn't address, because I got thousands of other slides I could put in if needed. So let's go ahead now and sort of jump to this issue. And really a good way for me to frame this challenge in the field is to really ask the question of, how do you solve a problem like misinformation? And we have a little commentary here, and it's just a short little commentary, but it's a general question that we ask in our center quite often. How do you solve a problem like misinformation? How do you even measure things like misinformation? And we see kind of 3 important distinctions when it comes to addressing this issue of misinformation. And it's not just misinformation about health issues, it's misinformation generally. And these distinctions are this, really making sure that we understand the distinction between misinformation and disinformation. It seems like just a definitional exercise, but it's really important when we develop interventions and when we develop policies that we do distinguish that. And I don't see this distinction done enough in policy circles, and not enough when it comes to designing these interventions. And then there's this distinction between speech and action. There's so much talk, of course, about free speech. And I just want to bring that up because it probably will, at one point, might be a discussion point within your circles when it comes to, designing programs or discussions around misinformation, that this will come up. And I'll just mention a few things there. And then just this important distinction between those that sort of believe something by mistaken belief versus those that have a true conviction on a particular belief. And you have to treat those different groups, we have found over the years, differently. And if you use one strategy again, with one group mistakenly, that can, it won't always lead to success. We've learned, because some things we've done well and some things we've not done well. All right, so we will start with a little bit of definitions just to be sure. And then I'm going to give you some examples of this distinction between misinformation and disinformation. And a lot of times we jump straight to misinformation and disinformation. But a lot of this work, actually, if you look at the literature far before, fake news became a real issue in the 2000s, it's certainly been, an issue for centuries. But it certainly has risen to the public vernacular for, the last, I would say, nearly a decade. But the work on this in this area has been going on a long time. And a lot of times you would find the search term for that would be rumors. And when we talk about rumors, we're talking about unofficial and unverified stories about events that may turn out to be true or false. And so we tend to study rumors in our research institution. And some of those things turn out to be true and sometimes they don't. But for us, what we're interested in is seeing how these rumors spread online and across platforms. Now, misinformation more generally is one of the bigger envelopes, and it's the thing that you hear most often in the research circles and in the public and by journalists. And really, the way we define very simple information that's false, but not necessarily intentionally false, whereas disinformation does have that purposeful element. So it's purposely seeded or spread for a specific objective, which could be financial, political, or reputational. The challenge with disinformation is, number one, it's very, very hard to measure intention. And most often with disinformation, and we found this over studying these kinds of disinformation campaigns over the years, is that they're often built around a kernel of truth, but layered with distortions or exaggerations. They tend to be multi-stakeholder. They tend to have things that are true, some that are false. So it's very difficult to identify. So when people say that they're studying or they observe disinformation, that's not. Well, I find that it is true sometimes, but most of the time people really aren't looking at disinformation. Most of the time they're looking at misinformation, partly because, at least the way we define disinformation, it's very, very difficult to identify because of these reasons I've mentioned. But let me give you an example. So not far from where I live, which is near the University of Washington campus here in Seattle, there was a post on Facebook early on in the pandemic. And it was by a chiropractor, I think in Woodinville, that had posted something on Facebook that argued that 94% of the deaths reported by the CDC were wrong, and that only 6% of the deaths were COVID caused. Now, that's not true, but that was the claim. And the claim was based on this misunderstanding of comorbidities. So if you get COVID and then you get pneumonia and then you die, COVID is a cause for that kind of death. And also pneumonia as well, but it doesn't mean that the CDC was hiding 94% of those or overcounting by 94%. And of course, this was debunked later on, but not soon enough, because this particular thing was picked up by some influential accounts on Facebook. It was actually reposted by an influential QAnon individual on Facebook, and it actually launched all the way to the White House and was actually, I think, retweeted or reposted at the White House. So it started as just an individual post, not too far from where I live, by a chiropractor that, let's just call this misinformation. It wasn't intentional. It was just maybe a misunderstanding of how, CDC and other health institutions count mortality rates. And it got amplified all the way. So this would be an example. I would consider this an example of misinformation. But an example of disinformation, and is another example from early on in the pandemic, was the promotion and the creation and the strategic amplification of what was called, a video at the time was called Plandemic. And I won't go into detail about what that particular video is, but I'll just say that the video was full of both misinformation and disinformation. But it was the general campaign with multi-stakeholders and the strategic amplification of this particular video that puts it in that category more of disinformation. And they're different because you have an individual piece of information on the left here of this Facebook post versus this other example that included a whole bunch of different individuals, organizations. And again, it's hard to measure intent, but what we can say is there was a campaign nature to this other kind of example. So those are the kinds of things that we see. And when you write policies maybe at the platform level or at the federal level, or if you're at the European Union, or if you're writing policies to try to mitigate some of this, that you would need to treat these very differently when it comes to those kinds of things, and also the interventions that you develop. Because again, if it's just based on the one post, you might develop a set of interventions that help you address what was wrong with this post versus dealing with this entire complex campaign that was going on around this particular video. And by the way, the pandemic was, well, you can even probably guess what it was about when you just look at the title of what that was entailing. So that's the importance of this distinction between misinformation, disinformation. And then there's this issue of speech versus action. I won't spend a lot of time on this because this is not really a policy talk, but I think it's kind of important because we hear a lot about this issue of free speech when it comes to coming up with ways to address, this crisis of misinformation, especially when it deals with people's health. And a lot of times people will say, well, free speech allows me to say and do anything that I want. And there's also this important section in the Communication Decency Act. So this is the CDC, CDA section 230 that's going to be a discussion point in the Supreme Court. And actually, it is this Google Gonzalez case recently at the Supreme Court is another one of these examples that's going to be addressing this head on. But just to sort of tell you about these, really probably the most important, like 26 words, and in sort of the formation of the internet comes from this section. But no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So a lot of people will say those are the 26. I think there's 26 words. But anyway, one of the most important statements that led to the formation of the internet as we know it, and certainly social media, and how we address this going forward, whether this is going to be modified, removed, and both the Republicans and the Democrats want to remove it, but for different reasons. But the point here is this is going to be a pretty contentious issue. But I do want to mention, here's the most important point, and if I had more time, I could go into depth, but this is the most important point to take here, that neither the Constitution nor the federal law grant legal protections for harmful content just because the action involves free speech. And the example here, we have precedents through things like the Stolen Valor Act, which is this act that says you can lie about things like the Purple Heart. This was addressing the people that were lying about the Purple Heart. But you can't make money from it. So free speech, like you want to lie about it, you can lie about it. But if you lie about it and make money, it's against the law. And so this is an example where you do have free speech. But if I was, for example, to say I've got toothpaste that cures COVID, and I'm selling that toothpaste on this particular workshop today, and you went to buy my toothpaste, I make money on it, that is prosecute. You can, there are legal levers for addressing that. And then we've seen recent cases, big well-known cases like Alex Jones being, sued for billions of dollars for things that he said. And that both because, it wasn't going, reflecting back on the Stolen Valor Act that he was making money. This was for different reasons. But the point here is that there are policies that could address this in some ways. But it will be it's very difficult because of the importance of free speech. And I'm one of the strongest advocates of free speech. And so that's the challenge that we have. So the last one I want to just mention here is the importance between mistaken belief and conviction. So this is important. So, if you were to design something for health professional researchers, or if you were designing any kind of intervention when it comes to misinformation, it's really important with this distinction. And this is important because those in this group that have mistaken belief, those are individuals that if you do, try to come up with interventions, get them the right information, do pre-bunking, all those kinds of things, there's a chance where you can make some changes. Whereas those that truly have this conviction that, for example, that vaccines are going to cause autism, or, any sort of different kind of topic, those we need to address differently. And that won't involve just some simple off-the-shelf kinds of techniques that I'll talk about in the rest of the talk that we can address. And actually, the rest of the talk I'm going to talk about are going to be things assuming that this is an individual in the mistaken belief category versus those in the conviction category. And it's not that we don't ever think about the conviction category. We do. It forces us to think about it in a much different way when it comes to coming up with the types of interventions. And I do want to say, so a lot of times people will ask me, okay, of all the literature that you're reading, and all the work that's going on in misinformation studies. And by the way, there is a ton over the last just 3 or 4 years. I can't even keep up with it. And I try to, and I work on this every single day. There are thousands and thousands of papers across the disciplinary landscape that are publishing papers and doing work in what, maybe now is being called misinformation studies, but people call it different things. And there are a few consistent things that have come out. Most of the things are still up in the air, as to whether like the backfire effect really is, an issue. Actually, there's been a lot of research that shows the backfire effect is not something to be worried about. This is this idea that, if you give someone good information, it might backfire and make it worse. And that's actually led to a lot of bad policies with some health institutions. In fact, we had the director of the CDC visiting our center several weeks ago with our Department of Health leaders in the state of Washington. And one of the things that we learned is that, at least from some of the communication leaders in it, is that they weren't addressing some of the rumors that were coming their way because they had heard, and at the time it was true when it comes to the kind of research that was being done, that you wouldn't want to address certain rumors because you didn't want to give them oxygen. And that is true to a certain extent, but once something has gone viral, we absolutely need our health institutions to address those rumors. And that just goes to show how that's an element of misinformation around the research, and we need to be better at updating those things. And so there are things that, there's some evidence for against certain kinds of ideas that have been tested out there. But there are certain things, there's a couple things that have been shown over and over that work quite well. And one of the most important ones is pre-bunking. This is just a snapshot. This isn't First Draft is great, and there's other organizations, and we have colleagues that have done work in this area, and there's a lot of research on pre-bunking. But it's one of those few things in the research that is shown to be true, or shown to be quite effective again and again in different circumstances, on different topics, with different areas, different demographic areas of the population. So, this is this idea that if we know certain rumors are going to occur, like, for example, we know most of the time after a major hurricane, there's going to be images of sharks in the street, in the city where the hurricanes hit. And sometimes it's the exact same images of the sharks swimming through the street. So one of the things that journalists can do is say, hey, by the way, this hurricane looks like it's going to hit Miami. There's likely going to be rumors that sharks are swimming in the streets. That's a kind of, that's an innocuous example. It's not a, health issue. I'm just giving an example. Although in the most recent hurricane, there really was sharks swimming in the streets. So sometimes it actually can be the case, but the point here is that if we can pre-bunk rumors, and health professionals have been doing this for, so a lot of time, but we really need to lean into that in the health areas to really try to get ahead of some of these rumors by pre-bunking and say, these are the things that you're going to see online. Here's why that's not true. And then there's techniques for how you address that too. I mean, some people talk about the truth sandwich and other things, but there are more sophisticated ways, or actually even simpler ways too, to deal with some of these things. But pre-bunking, one of the things that actually works quite well. Also, the other thing that's really effective when training the public, or training anyone for that matter, because we're all needing to get better at this, is something called lateral reading. And this is an idea that's been tested by my colleagues, Bruce Weinberg at Stanford, and Mike Caulfield, who works in our center. And the idea here is that fact checkers do this do this really, really well. When you give them something to try and debunk or try to investigate, they don't stay on that individual web page very long. They immediately jump to another tab, who was the organization, when were they formed, who funds it, et cetera, instead of trying to just delve through the content and think that you can do all your debunking by looking at the content. And that, I think, is one of the more important things that we can teach anyone that's trying to develop better skills in this. And some of their more famous studies, showed that, even like professors, in history and, advanced readers were not always good at that. They thought they could sort of look at the content and dissect it there, whereas the fact checkers were better and more accurate, at least at the exercise that they gave, the challenge that they gave in this study, by just, getting onto another tab as soon as possible. And so this lateral reading is something that we need to teach the public and certainly new students on our campus. All right, so what I'm going to do for the last part here, I can't go through, I have 60 hours of lectures around some of these other issues that can help that group, that's mistaken belief group, become better information consumers, especially when it comes to health misinformation and information that comes wrapped in data and science. And so all these different topics, I'm not going to go through all these. I'm just going to give you a couple examples and maybe correlation, causation, selection bias, and data visualization if we have time. Maybe I'd love to talk about the nature of science. That's one of my favorite ones, but we won't have time today. So just as a reminder, and actually I have an entire chapter devoted to this in our book, Carl and I talk a lot about this. In fact, we could have written the entire book on selection bias because we see this example almost every single day. Mistakes made not just by the public, but by journalists, science journalists, and even the researchers themselves make this mistake. And so it's one of these really important skills that we need to get better at identifying. And selection bias occurs when the people or whatever you're sampling differ systematically from the population at large with respect to the question you're asking. And ignoring selection bias can produce misleading estimates about a population. We have infinite examples, but a really simple example that occurred early on in the pandemic was a news story that went viral. And we can study these things. So that's one of the things we track. We can see what stories go viral and see what made this thing go viral and how did it go viral. And this was a story that was based on some observations that dentists were making in the New Jersey, New York area. And the claim here was that they were seeing more and more patients, a higher frequency of patients that had severe dental issues. And their claim was it was because of masks. And they had all sorts of explanations and mechanisms for why that might be. Maybe it was not enough oxygen exchange, et cetera. But of course, that claim was wrong. This was a common example of selection bias in that they were seeing, the only patients they were seeing early in the pandemic were the ones that had severe issues. They couldn't sleep, they couldn't work. They weren't seeing people that were coming in regularly. So they did see a higher frequency of severe dental issues than they were before the use of masks. But that was not due to anything about the masks. That was due to the selection bias of only selecting those during a pandemic that would actually go into the dental office in the middle or at the beginning of a pandemic. Now, there are all sorts of different kinds of selection bias. We have this example in our lectures that we provide online and also in the book. But I like this example because it gives another way in which selection bias can arise. There's lots of forms of selection bias, not just one kind of selection bias. There's lots of different forms. And even before looking at selection bias, I always tell my students, if it sounds too good to be true or too bad to be true, it probably is. And what you're looking at is a post from the conversation. This is a place where a lot of academics will publish things, and then they can get picked up by the news. In this case, this was picked up by the Washington Post, a very good, news outlet, but certainly made a mistake in this case. And the claim here was that there were certain music genres that were so dangerous. In fact, here's my favorite quote about this, that they, murder across, I can't read it because I got Zoom in there. Okay, murder accounted for 6% of deaths across the sample, but was a cause of 51% of deaths in rap and musicians. This could be due to genre's strong association with drug-related crime and gang culture, and it's a cautionary tale to some degree. People who go into rap music or hip hop, they're in a much more occupational hazard profession compared to war. That's quite a claim. And if it sounds too bad to be true, it probably is, and it was in this case. So if I go back to this example, you see here that you have these different music genres here on the x-axis, and you have the average lifespan, and then they've displayed the U.S. female life expectancy and the U.S. male life expectancy. You see this dramatic drop. And so the question that I sort of ask is, and we do this exercise in class just to give you a sense of how we work with these kinds of examples as a way of teaching the public how to become better information consumers of data information, is to figure out what could be explaining this sort of thing. And what we want students to look at is, you see this dramatic drop. but there's clearly something wrong with this. And if we were in person, I'd have you raise your hand and talk to me about what you might be observing here, because it might be true that some of these genres are a little bit different, but they're certainly not this much different. And of course, this is not due to these music genres making them more dangerous than war. It's that individuals in these younger genres haven't had a chance to be 80 or 90 years old or 100 years old. So they didn't even get to have a chance to die when they did die at like the age of 80, for example. So it's not that they have time. It's not that the rap and hip hop stars are more likely to die young. I mean, it could be a small amount, but it's certainly not the amount that we say here. So this is something we call right censoring. But there's not just right censoring. There's left censoring. And we talk about those examples in our book and in our class. There's observation selection bias. There's all sorts of different selection bias things that you can look out for. And it's one of those things when it comes to health misinformation that if we can teach the public how to identify selection bias issues, we would be better off. I one time I was for fun just thinking of how many different news stories would be better consumed if we just taught them about selection bias. So I just really wanted to emphasize that. Now we have tons of other examples. You can see those in the book, or you can go to our website and you can find those kinds of things. Now, another principle that's super important when it comes to digesting health news and health research, whether you are a professional in the field or whether you're someone in the public that cares about that particular health issue, is this issue of causation and correlation. Of course, when I talk about this, the immediate thing students do is they kind of sit back in their chair, they nod their head and they go, I know correlation doesn't imply causation. Can we move on? And then I say, we can, but let me do some evaluation of you to see how well you do with this particular issue. And it turns out that people are way more confident in their ability to understand this than they really have the techniques for. And the reason why is not because they're not smart, it's just that it's really hard. Trying to differentiate correlation and causation is one of the big challenges of what we do in research. And even for those that do this for a living, this is difficult. In fact, one of the studies that was put out not too long ago really displayed this. There was a study that looked at, I think it was like the 50 or 100 most posted health-related research articles ever sort of out there, and they have different metrics for measuring this. And one of the things that they found is that half of the articles were misattributed by the science journalists themselves. So these are science journalists. They probably have a little level of skill when it comes to this more in the public, and they missed half. And the worst thing is that a third of the articles by the researchers themselves conflated correlation and causation. So this is a hard thing even for those that do this professionally. And this is so XKCD. I like Carl and I really enjoy using XKCD to make points, but here's just a funny cartoon when it comes to this. I used to think that correlation implied causation. Then I took calling bullshit. This is our class. Now I don't. Seems like the class helped. Well, maybe. And that would be the right response. And we have the students. This is a question we've given on a test before, and explain why this is funny. That's always kind of a hard one. But here's just some simple examples then. I mean, here, University of Michigan's kind of one of our rivals or whatever. And so we can throw back and forth at each other some examples. But here's an example of this. Getting back to work quickly is good for you. This is something they posted. We know without question that the sooner an employee returns to work, better their recovery is going to be. I'll let you think about that one, why that might be a problem with causality. But here's a health-related example from the pandemic that was another viral spreading piece of news. It went worldwide. It was on a lot of these, major news sites and media sites. This particular one was posted in Forbes, and the claim here, and it was based on a research study, was that bald men were at a higher risk of severe coronavirus symptoms. And if you dig into what they were asking, they were not just looking at an association between baldness and COVID risk. So that's where the dotted line represents. That would be an association. We do these block diagram exercises in our class all the time. They're really implying, their hypothesis here is that endocrine was involved in this pathogenesis of COVID, and therefore baldness was actually causing an increase in COVID risk. And there's a real article this is not like an article from a predatory journal that's not been peer reviewed. This is a good article, and mistakes are made. I always tell people it's okay. These mistakes are made. And this was published in the Journal of American Academy of Dermatology. and it's got this, complicated figure here, figure 2, that explains how the androgen pathway might be involved. But instead of doing all this work, they forgot something pretty darn important. So did all the science journalists that reported on it. And that is that, that age is also a risk factor for hair loss. And that common cause was a much better explanation. And Forbes had to retract this and said this piece has been clarified to note that the study did not control for age, which is a risk factor for both hair loss and severe COVID-19. And when we do these exercises around causality, we talk about the different ways in which you can be mixed up, whether it's common cause or all sorts of different techniques that we go through. I don't have time to go through all of them, but it's not just know that correlation doesn't imply causation and you're done. There are different techniques that you can learn that will help you identify those more often. And that will help you then sort of identify when it goes awry in the public. And here's an example of a large, expensive study that was done. And it was an observational study. And they were very careful in the study to say it was observational. And it says, it's an observational only, and so there's correlation only, and reports this correctly. And it doesn't mean that in this case that leisure time physical activity doesn't reduce different types of cancer. It could, but this study was observational. And so it didn't make this causative claim, but that's not what was reported in the public. Exercise can lower risk of some cancers. Time magazine, US News Report, exercise cuts cancer risk, huge study finds, exercise drives down the risk of 13 cancers, etc. And what happens is these correlations, by the way, correlations don't sell newspaper headlines as well as causative ones. We've known that. And that's where, again, the incentives kind of get in the way and can cause problem when it comes to health misinformation. But what generally happens in a scientific paper is that they'll say moderate consumption of wine is correlated with reduced risk of heart disease. The news report comes out and it doesn't say that. It says red wine consumption reduces heart disease. So it uses that causative language, just like these examples here, where it says drives down, that's causative, cuts cancer risk, lowers risk, uses those kind of causative claims. And so it'll make this claim reduces heart disease. And then it moves all the way to prescriptive claim. And that's what you hear, on TV later that night, that drink a glass of red wine with dinner to stave off heart disease. Now, of course, in the last couple of days, there's been a lot of news about a big meta study that looked at, no levels of alcohol are helpful for health. And, now people can sort of look into that themselves, looking for these kinds of these issues. So now we've got, we've kind of gave a couple examples of correlation, causation, selection bias. Let me just talk just quickly about data visualization, and then we'll start to wrap up so we have an open discussion here. So one of the things that we see all the time are just honest mistakes when it comes to visualization. This was, and I think that was the case with this example. This was a heat map that was put out by the Georgia State Department of Health. Excuse me. And they were trying to make a comparison between one that was posted on July 2nd and one on July 17th. They say, look, there's not much difference. And this is when there was a lot of debate about what to do with masks and lockdowns, et cetera. And the problem here is that you can't compare these, mainly because these are using different bins. So here, if they were the same bins, then you would say, okay, these maps are pretty similar. But the bins are so different that these are very different maps. And this, to their credit, they admitted that they made that mistake. And they said, well, the software just automatically, scaled this. And I believe that's true. But it also goes to show that if you're, a health organization, you have to be extra careful about these techniques when it comes to visualization misinformation. And also, I always remind people to listen to Hanlon's razor in their ear when they see these things, that don't be super aggressive in their response. Just, understand that mistakes can happen, and that never ascribe to malice what can be adequately explained by incompetence, and better than that, never ascribe to incompetence what could be understandable mistake. Now, one of the most important things when thinking about visualization manipulation of this information is something called the principle of proportional ink. And that's when a shaded region is used to represent a numeric value, and the area of that should represent that numerical value. And this was originally talked about by Edward Tufte. It was built on this idea that Tufte has talked about for a long time. And so here's an example. I've shown this example before, but it's a good example for showing how if you zoom in far enough with a bar graph, you can show a vast, major difference. And this was published in Maclean's to make a claim that, those Quebecois individuals just don't have as much trust as the rest of Canada. You see this massive difference. But if you added up the pixels in both of these different colors, they wouldn't represent the numbers that are currently being represented. They're much bigger. And if you were to replot it, you'd see a much different story. There is a difference, but there's not this massive difference that you see. And so we talk to students about making sure that when using bar graphs, you go down to 0 so that you see the full reflection of those. The numerics will correspond more to the actual pixels devoted to the visual difference. But with line graphs, you certainly don't have to go to 0, but then you can have problems when layering these kinds of things that tell manipulative stories. And this was a graph that was, saying, look how close these are when you look at MMR coverage and autism prevalence. Look, they must be causing each other. But this was, of course, layered on exactly to manipulate in a way to sort of tell that story, when in fact, when you separate them and you put them on the 0, you see a much different story. And you see this big gap, by the way, here. That exists, but it's a very different story than when you layer those together. So you see a lot of manipulation with when you have multiple y-axes, and also when people say, well, look how close it matches. Now, this is an example of looking at like thyroid cancer, incidence of thyroid cancer, and the percent of corn and soy planted with this glyphosate applied to it. And you say, look, they're both going up, although it's kind of interesting with this one because it goes all the way down to -10, which doesn't make a lot of sense all by itself. But of course, there was this shifting just to make it look like this red line and blue line sort of line exactly with this incidence. But the one thing I tell people is find another example of something that goes up. And so here I took that exact same data. So this is the same data. I just replot it in a black and white plot, and then I layered on the mobile phone subscribers. And I can make this also go up and make it look the same. So just because you've got them aligned by this manipulation of these axes doesn't mean that they're just fully aligned and now you've got a story. Because there's lots of things over time. When you look at time series graphs, you're going to see that a lot. So the lesson here is that be careful of the stories, especially with time series, where you say, well, look, this goes up and this goes up. They must be associated. And so there's all sorts of information visualization tricks. We give multiple lectures just on information visualization. So these are just some teasers to think about when trying to train yourself and also to train others, especially when it comes to the millions of graphs that are created to make health claims. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here with just a couple other quick points. We know that people are poor editors. We're not trained to do that. Even those that are trained, it's a hard thing to do, but so are algorithms. They're not good editors either. And a lot of times we'll go to things like a search engine, like Google, and think, I'll search Google, and if I find something, then it must be true. And it's become a part of society. If it shows up on Google, that gives it some truth, which of course, that's not the case. And so we do an exercise in our lab a lot of times. We'll say, think of a question that you don't think Google will find. That's just preposterous when it comes to health issues. And one of the ones that we came up with a long time ago is one of the first ones is we say, do vaccinations cause shaken baby syndrome? You think of all things that connect vaccinations to some other thing, how could it possibly be linked to shaken baby syndrome? There couldn't be any websites. Well, if you search this and we search this, this was a screenshot back in 2017. And of course, we update a lot of these. We do a ton of these different kind of questions. There are websites with this, shaken baby syndrome here, dangerous vaccines found to cause symptoms of shaken baby syndrome, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason why this happens is that Google's gobbling up everything. And so are all these chatbots that are gobbling up the internet. They're gobbling up a lot of stuff that's just not true. And the public and the health institution doesn't have time to debunk all the crazy claims out there. But when people search that, they might think, it shows up on Google, so it must be true. Or I asked ChatGPT-4 about it, it must be true. And so this is a real concern that I think we have when it comes to health misinformation, especially in this new era of this new chatbot area that we're going into. And there's been all this attention, of course, about OpenAI's new ChatGPT. I'm on a panel tonight. We have a big university discussion about the role of these chatbots and ChatGPT in particular on education and research. And we'll be talking about this tonight. And I have a recent op-ed about this in the Seattle Times, just a short little op-ed about my opinion and concerns when it comes to misinformation. But it's something we're going to have to deal with in the information science world, in the library world, in the research world, in the health world. And so we should be starting to think about these issues. But I just want to give one example of why I think there's reasons to be skeptical. So there's a whole bunch of other chatbots out there, not just OpenAI's and the one that Bing's using, Google, Facebook, they've all come up with their own too. And one of the things that my colleague Carl Bergstrom decided to do, which was, I thought, one of the best examples of the problems with these things, is to ask it about Brandolini's law. This is a real law that if you go to Wikipedia, it's called the bullshit asymmetry principle. It's a very simple but important principle we talk about in our book and our class. And that is the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than needed to produce it. And actually, I think it's orders of magnitude. It's easy to create bullshit, hard to clean it up. So we asked, Meta's version of this. So it's Galactica at the time was supposed to be this, large language model that was going to sort of transform science and basically write papers for you and Wikipedia entries on science issues. And, it did a few things good, and like any of these, some of it is quite amazing. But when we asked it about this particular principle, this is asking about the bullshit principle, it bullshitted us back. It basically said a bunch of stuff that was not true. Brandolini's law is a theory in economics proposed by Brandolini, a professor. The smaller the economic, none of this is true. And yet it does it with 100% confidence. That's the real problem, is that it says it says true things and false things with the same level of confidence. And the challenge will be going forward when it comes to health misinformation, and health misinformation, that there's going to be things that look quite good. And people think, well, I can trust this bot and give me good health information. But what happens when that 10%, or in this case, it was a lot more than 10%, but let's just imagine that it's only 1 out of 10 things that it gets wrong, or 1 out of the 10 content it gets wrong. That's still highly problematic, especially when it comes to health misinformation. And by the way, it's not the first time that we've seen this sort of stuff before. I really see these, these chatbots as, autocomplete machines on steroids. And this was done many years ago. This was an example of someone who got a published paper using autocomplete on their phone. It was in a journal that was known not to be, some might claim it's predatory or not, but it's not known to, let's say, be the best journal out there. It's not, someone, essentially, here's the abstract, you don't need to read it. It's basically autocomplete. It was autocomplete on an Apple iPhone, and that's a little bit what's happening now. And this was many years ago, and it got published using the autocomplete. And it was almost a foreshadowing of what we might be seeing in the research publication world. And this is something we talk about in that Carl and I talk about in this Nature Medicine commentary that I mentioned early on the top. So let me, actually, I might skip this because I want to leave some time for discussion. So I'm going to skip this last part and just say one more thing about AI, because we're seeing it more and more in the medical research world. And one of the more important things that we can teach the public, and we talk about this in our book, is really something called the black box schema, that you don't need to know all the details of a large language model or some fancy regression analysis or any other black box procedure. You can ignore that if you spend time thinking about the data input or the data output and the interpretation of it. We have many examples of how you can apply this black box schema to issues of new technology coming out in research around health issues. And so I'll give you an example. So in the pandemic, there was all this excitement about using computer vision and AI to detect pneumonia and problems from things like COVID. And there were many papers doing this. It wasn't just 1 or 2 papers, there was a lot of them. But there was, the more interesting work was looking at what these what these machines were actually seeing. And using the black box procedure. You didn't need to know about what fancy machine learning algorithm they were using. You just needed to sort of set up this box and say, okay, in this case, they were making this claim between disease state and image features, that they would produce some image features, and then the AI would be able to see those image features. So that's the idea here. And really, they were going a step further, saying disease state led to these image features that the AI could then see. But if you actually looked at what those images were looking at, it wasn't anything about the with any of the sort of inflammation in the lungs or anything like that. It was looking at it ended up looking at things about like where the radiograph was taken. Was it inpatient, outpatient? The orientation of the diaphragm, things that had nothing to do with the actual pneumonia. And AI is good at those sorts of things, but that doesn't mean it can see things that doctors can't see. And so in this case, hospitals have different baseline pneumonia rates. And so it was the hospital that was leading to these different disease rates and image features. So the system learns to tell the hospital apart. And that could be interesting too. And you can tell whether it's supine or portable, and that would tell you about the severity of the disease. That's still interesting, but it doesn't mean that they can see something that they can't. And so the imaging procedure as well sort of were things that were better explanations than this sort of connection between disease state and image features that the AI was seeing. And so this is just an example, again, of the kinds of things we're going to see in the medical research world a lot. And we need to have some techniques for addressing some of these large claims that come into our field so that we don't get hoodwinked by it. So I started with this issue around the Surgeon General, health misinformation, serious threat, how it can cause confusion, because it has and it doesn't affect people's health. And I think that of all groups, it's all of you in the world of information science that I think that we as a community have a responsibility. I guess it's a call to action. I think many of you have already been doing it most of your careers, so it's not like it's new. But I think really, I think when the Surgeon General is paying attention now, when national organizations are now looking at this information health problem, I think it's time for us in the information science world to really step up, because that's what we've been doing for hundreds of years in the library world. I work in a library school, that's why I can say that too, but you all do it in practice as well. And as just a reminder, the resources I mentioned, you can go to this link. And I wanted to leave plenty of time for some open discussions, questions, comments from all of you. So I'll just end with a take-home message here that we are drowning in misinformation. Much of it's quantitative, and it's certainly a lot of it is related to health misinformation. We need to be aware of misleading data graphics. I didn't go into super detail, but it was just a way of teasing you and thinking about that. And be careful not to mix up causation and correlation. And there's also issues of technology arising that's going to make our job even more difficult in detecting what's true and what's not. And the COVID pandemic has put this really into a life or death context. So numerical literacy and intervening on misinformation can literally save lives. So with that, I'll end and open it to discussion. Thanks so much for listening. I wish I was in person so I could see you all and then interact with some coffee afterwards and before. But thank you for all that you do in your field, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jevin. And yes, we do have about 15 minutes for some questions, and we ask that you put those in the Q&A if you can, so that we can better see those and separate those from the chat. And it's certainly, your presentation certainly has got the chat going, and it's been very lively. And so we hope that
I love it. I see all these messages. I love it. I love it. Librarians, like, that's why I love working with librarians every day, because it's always the one of the most interactive groups. So thank you so much, and thank you for listening. You're welcome. Well, I'll start off while you're thinking of. I see a question. How is consensus different from ChatGPT? Thanks for asking. So consensus, first of all, it's mostly built on what's called claim extraction. So this is an NLP technique that goes and identifies. This has been developed not by us. This is just applying methods that already exist and are open out there. There are techniques in natural language processing that can identify a claim and an argument. So the idea is that it goes and it looks for the claims in a research paper. So when you ask a question, we look for how that question relates to the claims that are been extracted from millions of papers, biomedical papers. Well, and it's actually not just biomedical, but we focus primarily on the biomedical literature. And so ChatGPT-4 really is all by itself is something that ingests everything, and you can think of it as autocomplete. And what it does is it goes about looking, pulling all the different, gazillions of phrases using, billions of different parameters. And then when you give it a question, it's sort of looking at the most probable answer. And that's why it looks very well written, because it's built on all of that. And so the way that we use ChatGPT-4 in consensus, it's separate from the claim extraction. We use it as a way of summarizing a selection of papers. So it's not based on the entire corpus of the internet. Well, I mean, it's trained, ChatGPT-4 is trained on that. But the only thing that we have it really doing in consensus is doing quick summaries of, let's say, a collection of articles that you have. That's not how it comes up with the results for your query. That's based on claim extraction. Whereas if you go to Bing, if you're one of those individuals that's not on the wait list, like I still am, we're trying to test all sorts of things in the lab. But you, in that case, you're asking it a question like, tell me all the flat screen TVs that would fit within this, dimension or whatever. It can go out there and answer that question. It's not necessarily based on claims. It's based on this chatbot. And by the way, I don't claim to be an expert in large language models. I have colleagues that are that. And on the panel I am on tonight, I'm more the critiquer of these technologies, and then we'll have experts on it. But yeah, that's the difference, that consensus mostly is built on claim extraction with this extra little feature at the end that'll help summarize a collection of papers in a way that makes it more convenient for quickly moving through the literature. But that's not the core. The core technology is not based on that. In fact, that's the distinguishing. I think it's actually a distinguishing quality from what's being developed in other forms. Having ChatGPT do all that work, we're more separated. We're basically trying to retain a lot of the science, writing and knowledge, and not try to have it be fully run by a chatbot. Anyway, I could go in more detail, but thanks for asking that. So I'll say that was answered, and I'll go to the next one. Can you recommend a good basic primer on the ethics behind AI, ChatGPT, and the like? That is a great question. I can't think of anything right offhand, but I'll tell you what, Sally, send me an email and I will do some looking in my bibliography, and I will find some things, because I've been reading them through discussions in our lab meetings. I just can't think of anything right offhand. I mean, to be honest, it's so new right now, and good ethicists take a long time. They're philosophers and they take a long time to think through things. There haven't been a ton of things out. It's been more reporting and what the consequences are, and futurists are writing about this, and then myself just writing about some of the obvious issues that are going to come about from these chatbots. But a really good primer on the ethics of ChatGPT would be interesting. Now, there's been ethics behind AI, tons of stuff on that. I have colleagues that in my department, information school, that work on a lot of that. But that could be, the ethics of, algorithmic ethics. That could be data ethics. It could be all sorts of things. But you got me thinking about the ChatGPT one. I will send me an email and I'll find one for you. Please talk more about conspiracy theory. Consider this term problematic, but curious about your thought. Yeah, that's an interesting question. First of all, conspiracy theories, well, I would just say, first of all, a lot of these terms that we use in the field of misinformation, first started with fake news, and then that became loaded. The misinformation, of course, and disinformation are loaded terms already too. And these things morph, and their meaning morphs in both science conversations, but also public conversations. And I think conspiracy theory has that as well. And I will say this about conspiracy theories: some conspiracies end up they're rumors, and sometimes they're true. But a lot of times conspiracy theories get they sort of add sort of a negative a negative valence to a topic that might not deserve it either, just by that association of conspiracy theory. And a lot of people, are offended to be saying, well, you consider me a conspiracy theorist because, I believe X or I believe Y. And so we are kind of careful. It's interesting you brought that up, because we're kind of careful about using the term conspiracy theory, but we do still use it, because there are that's how it's used in the literature. And yeah, I guess what you're probably getting at is that it's problematic in its association, and maybe this isn't exactly what you mean, but there is, at least this is how we look at it sometimes, it's problematic in its association with certain topics. And so we have to be extra careful when we use it, but we don't completely remove the term. We do study groups that believe in different kinds of conspiracy theories. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's what you're getting. I'm probably not giving a good answer on this one, but I'd have to think about that one for sure. Okay, some scholars claim that the information deficit model, giving more people information, will help change minds, is a unicorn. It'd be nice if it worked, but it doesn't. In your work, how do you account for the social, emotional, and cultural components of trust and belief when it comes to misinformation? Just the fact, Margaret, that you wrote that knows that you know this really well. the information deficit model, like give them more information and it'll be better, is absolutely the fact that it doesn't change minds is absolutely true. It's not just us. We have colleagues in this field and in our network of centers that study this that have shown this over and over. So that's absolutely the case. And it's much more important to engage on the social emotional issues. And that's also why when you look at clickbait, the most successful clickbait tends to, hijack these emotional elements of a story, and that's why you see this. That's why it's so successful, and algorithms use it all the time. And so that's why this project that we're talking about, I mentioned early on, co-designing for trust, where we have gone full in on this issue of social, emotional, and cultural components of it. And when we went to the NSF, we've done projects that deal specifically with technology, deal specifically with the observational studies and how you go about building policies to intervene in misinformation. But we just went all in on this. And so the idea here is to work with the community so that we can engage with the emotional, historical, cultural, social issues here. And I think it's one of the most important things. And that's why I put that one example when I showed the resources, that co-designing for trust. It's really my way of saying I'm all in on really thinking about ways to incorporate that into the intervention strategies. And so, yeah, I mean, this is, we can throw all sorts of good information. I can give all 60 hours of my lecture from my class to an individual, but that's not going to work unless I really engage some of those cultural components. In fact, just yesterday, you would love this. So we had the site visit from the National Science Foundation. You would love this because it relates to your question. During our site visit from the National Science Foundation, because this is something new for the National Science Foundation. They don't just typically, support these kinds of social science kinds of projects. We went into one of our communities. It was an active session where we went into one of our communities, one of the Black communities in the Seattle area, and we spent the afternoon working with them in a real session, a real workshopping session, where we talk about misinformation and disinformation. And I think the NSF representatives saw pretty quickly that in doing this work and to build these interventions with them, we had to engage with those cultural components. And it was really fun to see that the NSF program officers were really starting to see. Well, they see it because they're supporting. So I'm not going to say we convinced them, I would just, by the way, I'm not the one running this. I'm just a collaborator on this. This is run through my colleague, Jason Young and Sean Glaze. They're the ones, and Amer at University of Texas, who does a lot of this work on co-designing and really understands this. And so, yes, this is an absolute critical component. Oh, interesting. I just saw this real quick comment by Aaron Bowen. I had a student look into 4 resources and help there. It turns out 3 of the 4 were 100% fabricated. So this is interesting. So we did a little exercise to see how often, these bots are just making up references. And this is something we as librarians train our students all the time to say, make sure you reference your claims and your arguments, and make sure when you're assessing an argument, look into their references. And so that's a key component of how we communicate as researchers and as humans in a professional sense. And yet a lot of these AI systems are just making up these references. And apparently there's some fixing going on behind the scenes at OpenAI around this, because people have noted this. In fact, one of my colleagues actually built a detector. So anytime they ask for references, they then look those up using DOIs and other things quickly. And it was, of course, making up junk all the time. And so that's really problematic if it's adding references that are just made up, and that adds to a sort of a synthetic literature that could really cause havoc. So anyway, that one's a real problem. Could AI be used for pre-bunking health misinformation? Yes, I mean, it's interesting, Inga, I talk a lot about the problems with AI, but maybe we could, use this technology to do some of the things like pre-bunking. And I do think it has some potential, and we might as well, since they're out here and going to be used anyway, we might as well find ways in which they could potentially be used for things like that. And I think you're right. Pre-bunking would probably be the best one, because it could summarize things quite quickly. So yeah, I would say that is probably one of the, I appreciate that comment, because I think it's probably one of the best things I can think of AI doing, at least in the misinformation space, because pre-bunking could just be regurgitating a lot of the good information that we want to get out there and to let people know about rumors and memes that are going to come their way. Okay, so some medical schools require to publish before they can graduate. I told a residency director about China and she looked very sad. I know. ChatGPT is really kind of, changing that. I allowed ChatGPT in my most recent class last quarter. I was actually a class on machine learning, and I said, okay, I'm not asking good enough questions if the ChatGPT can answer it super easily. And so I let them use it, and sometimes it was effective, and maybe there's ways in which they can incorporate it, and that's what we're going to talk about on this panel tonight. And some people have said, well, maybe we'll just become editors rather than content creators, but I think that's problematic all by itself. And it's this other problems about making up references, and a lot of it, a good portion of it still just being made up, that we can't, we almost takes more work to do all the cleanup to figure out what it's got right and what it's got wrong. And also the exercise of writing is not just the output itself, it's also the ability to think through a problem carefully. I mean, these are all things we all know, but there probably are going to be ways that we can creative using, and I think universities and research institutions are going to be figuring this all out over the next couple of years. I have some back in the 1990s, Colbring Harbor Press had somebody come to the library to check every reference in a book chapter to make sure it was real. What? No way. That's amazing. I love that. Real humans coming to check every reference. Well, actually, one of our suggestions in this commentary in Nature Medicine is to say that we need to do better auditing of our references, because the references aren't just support for our argument. They are the ingredients of our recommender systems and search engines. They are the currency of promotion in the academic world. They're used for so many different things. And if we just have this mess of a citation highway out there, it's going to have detrimental effects. And so having at least at the publication stage, have people auditing would be helpful. Just like we need auditing of some of the statistical methods before a research paper goes out. I think that would be good as well.
Jevin, we're getting at the top of the hour, so as much as I'd like you to keep answering questions, I think I better.
I'm going through all these comments. I will stop, but oh my gosh, there's so many good comments that I didn't address. Feel free to reach out to me, and thanks, for thinking about this problem. I think we're all going to be dealing with this challenge for years to come. And I think, again, I said it already, and I know that you all know this already, but I think it's the field of information science is really, I think, the one that can help address some of this. So we got to do it because it involves people's health and the research that we do in health.
Well, thank you. We have a couple more things I want to go over before we end this session. And let's see if I can get that up here. And I just wanted to also say, Jevin, you don't need to comment about here, but I saw several comments about, your class that you had for high school students, but mentioned for health sciences classes and graduate students, saying with an escape room, they would seem to be a lot of interest for that.
Oh, wonderful. Yes.
Yeah.
Please email me. I'll drop my email in here just so everyone has it. But feel free to, or you can email actually our center about it too, but feel free to email me and I will get you information on the escape room and also the Misinfo Day, all those materials. In fact, I'll just, actually it's not going to everyone. Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Carol. I know you have things to cover.
Okay, that's all right. Well, thank you, Jevin. This has been a great way to start off our second day of the symposium. It's been very lively and engaging, and thank you again for that. I just have a few things for some of you who might be interested in claiming MLA, CHES, MCHES, or CPH CE credits for this session and others, that you will receive an email after the symposium ends with a questionnaire and instructions to claim CE. I also want to encourage you to join the network. Membership is organizational, not individual, and it offers benefits such as funding opportunities and print resources. We have just about 30 minutes until our next session, and we want to encourage you to visit one of the booths in the exhibit hall, as well as take a break from your computer and to stretch and move, and maybe even step outside. And we will see you in our next sessions that start at 1:30 Eastern time. But I also wanted to mention that we have a health misinformation webinar series in case you want to explore health misinformation as after this symposium. The series features presentations from expert speakers, and it's going to enable librarians and public health professionals and health educators and healthcare providers to explore various aspects of health misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, and learn practical and evidence-based solutions and how to identify and how help to curb the spread. These presentations will be scheduled intermittently throughout the year, and you can learn about upcoming sessions by checking out our NNLM training calendar. And I think our chat people will put some links in there as well for you to see the series. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Jevin. This has been great. It was great reconnecting with you and to have you again at our NNLM events. And we hope you all have a great rest of the day and that you can attend some of the other sessions. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.